All right, welcome. Another episode of the podcast. Very excited today. Welcome my dear friend of the podcast, Seb Francois. Welcome.
Hello, thank you for having me. I'm happy to be with you too, actually.
It's been a while.
Yes.
Introduce yourself for our lovely listeners of the podcast.
Yes. I've been working at UB for 5 years now, I think. 4 years as a user researcher, 3 on Rainbow Six Siege, and with you. A lot of that time with you, actually. I think that's why
Don't you
we're going
forget
to
it.
check. Yeah, I think that's why we're going to chat about it today. And for the last year now, I've transitioned into UX designer position onto the same project, Rainbow Six Siege. I come from more of like a game design background, like design background, rather than academic research and stuff like that. I think that could also explain what we're going to talk about and how we tackle things. And so I transitioned back into a designing role, and basically I focus on core gameplay stuff.
Great. Yeah, so happy to have you here. I think your perspective is always very interesting to me. We enjoy continuing chatting, even though we're kind of both in different positions. But yeah, we worked together for I don't know, I think 3 years on Siege before you betrayed me and left to go work on production. But happy for you.
We still chat, so it's not so bad.
It's okay. We still get to work with each other just
Yeah.
in different ways. So I asked Seb specifically to join me today to discuss something I was gonna say like near and dear to our hearts, but I don't know, I guess it is near and dear to our hearts. Something we discuss a lot, and something that was very kind of pivotal to our work experience on Siege specifically together. I've touched on leveraging design play sessions several times in the podcast in a lot of different episodes, especially in our last episode where we talked a lot about, or I guess the two previous episodes, talking about blending into the design cycle. So if you haven't listened to those, I really would encourage you to go back, listen to them, come back here, because we're going to share some more in-depth details of how exactly we leveraged the design plus play sessions on Siege. So I want to give some more kind of context to a lot of the kind of just leverage play sessions conversations that we've had many times. So for context, I want to take us back to early 2018. Because I think that's probably about when things, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you'd been on Siege for a little bit longer, working in a slightly different position, but you'd been on Siege a bit before then. I arrived more or less full time onto the project about February because I remember being there around SI. Um, so basically, we were both coming in round about early 2018. January, February was really when we were kind of fully integrating into the cell. So keeping in mind, Siege had it had been live for over 2 years at this point, and user research support had been relatively light. We hadn't had a lot of dedicated kind of analysts such as ourselves leading up to that. So you have a project that is live that has had spotty user research support for a bit, and then a new pair of analysts kind of coming in. So with that, play sessions played kind of a big part in as we were kind of integrating ourselves in. So I want to talk a bit about kind of this play session, how we leveraged and integrated them, kind of how we did that, and what was the outcome. Because I think we'll be able to share some really interesting kind of tips for a lot of other people who are maybe looking at this and are feeling a bit overwhelmed with this idea of, okay, I understand what design play sessions are, but I don't really see where I could fit in. So this is the discussions we're going to be having is basically over the course of just a few months. So based on my emails going back through, it looks like we took over fully of play sessions about May of 2018.
Mhm.
And
Possibly.
so yeah, I had emails of you organizing play sessions.
Okay.
So So I can confirm that it was about then. So maybe do you want to give a little bit of a, since you're a designer now, a little bit of context of kind of briefly what a design play session kind of looks like?
Yeah. So I think, yeah, design play session, if we talk more specifically about Siege, I think it gives a good idea of what it can be, because basically the gameplay loop of Siege is 5v5 competitive multiplayer. So it was fairly natural for designers at the time to just be 5v5 and test out new content and prototypes. So it was fairly natural to have those play sessions and then come in for that. So yeah, design play sessions were just used to try out a prototype, see how it feels in actual play conditions, and see where they can go from there. So they relied on that a lot. Again, especially because that's the core gameplay loop of the game.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so I think it could, like, obviously, like, your mileage may vary, right? Depending on like the design of the game that you're working on, but specifically within the context of Siege, it really was this place where we were really kind of seeing and feeling these prototypes kind of in action in like a 5v5 or simulated type of environment. So they were really used for kind of, verifying the different content. And so it was something that was happening like daily, right? Like you've got a lot of different pieces of content kind of being tested, and with Siege there was a lot of different cells and a lot of different people working on different pieces of content. So this was something we were very well aware that was happening, right? So we weren't necessarily running a lot of large scale studies at this point. We were really running, from what I can tell, like we ran like a few smaller scale user tests, a couple other like workshops and things like that. But that was kind of leading into the play session.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I think the other part of user research that was done more frequently was the workshops done with pro players because of the esports scene. And but to be honest, it was fairly close to what a play session would be. Obviously more
back
focused,
then,
but yeah.
So jumping into kind of the first question that I want to discuss is why should we be leveraging these design play sessions as user researchers? Like, what's your perspective on that?
I think what's great about them is that it benefits both parties like a lot. Like for you as a user research, you get to arrive at a like very early in the process, like very first iterations of a prototype. So you are very early, and you can follow up the prototype. So let's say in Siege we have operators, so characters with special abilities. It's very easy to be there from the very first prototype and to follow the process up until the release. So being there as early as the first play sessions was very valuable for that, because you get to understand the design, the intention, what is working, what is failing, and then for designers, like, you can help them iterate very efficiently, because you try to bring perspective basically into what they're doing, because quite often it was mostly designers, sometimes a few programmers, so it was about bringing new perspective also in there. So depending on the timing also, sometimes it's so early that some players, they struggle to, and that's completely fair, but they can struggle to imagine what that prototype could be in the future. So depending on when we would have varying types of players, but at least at the beginning, trying to bring some fresh perspective into that was very valuable, and see what was working and what should be the next step, and how could we iterate from that.
Yep. I think you touched on a lot of interesting things where it's like, I think there's a lot of opportunity for just kind of integrating yourself like into the process and the team. I think there's a lot of kind of reservations towards, I don't know, like taking ownership or participating or leading design play sessions because they aren't perfect from a research perspective, right? And I think that there is some reservations of, well, we can't necessarily control for all of the variables of like who's participating, right? Like you're touching on, sometimes it's literally like the design team, the groups of designers, the gameplay programmers, whomever are kind of participating in this. And obviously this is not the most like ideal scenario for audience. And so I think that there is sometimes reservation when I'm talking with researchers. I kind of get this sense where it's like, well, we want to make sure we're controlling for all of this, but I think the beauty with play sessions is that, they aren't perfect, but they're happening.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can really become a part of something that is free.
Yeah,
Right?
I think
It's there. You have an audience, and you can just integrate and become a part of it.
yeah, it's and also it would happen without you anyway. So and it
Yes.
would be most probably much worse. Like and to be honest, I can leave that situation right now as a designer, and because that big thing, where we had to work from home and stuff like that, I think it changed a lot of things. But basically, yeah, it would be happening anyway without our input, and I think the very, very strong value that user researcher can bring to that process is perspective. Because exactly as you described, like because of the conditions in which we are playing, like the people playing, at what time, in what state, it's introducing so much variable and also
Bias.
and a lot of bias, and it's so easy to not know what to do next, basically. And
Yep.
like we need user researchers' perspective on previous studies, on various types of player, because it's so easy to think about your design. Because as a designer, you try to have perspective as much as you can, try to think about different types of player, but it's not always easy.
There's limitations to it.
Yes, yeah,
You can't know the full picture.
yeah, and that's why I think user researcher at that point in time are super valuable because and also just basic human biases, like like, oh, okay, it's not a player, it's my director giving that feedback. It's
Yeah.
it's not a programmer, it's a designer. So even those kind of biases too are important, and just
Yeah.
being able to take a step back as well.
I think it's a really good point. I think it's like, as a researcher, you're able to kind of look at that a bit more objectively, right? You're able to evaluate and kind of weight, like, okay, obviously all of these people have a very in-depth knowledge of the game, but you can help identify the pieces of feedback that are helpful. I think from the researcher's perspective, some of the things that you touched on, there's so much discussion and things happening, a lot of rich information that's occurring in play sessions. Even if you're just there observing, asking questions, listening, playing with them, I think is a huge way of just really understanding the design, for one, the decision making process, which I think is very important, and who the decision makers are. There's a lot of very interesting pieces of information that you can get just observing. You don't even have to be leading these. You just need to be there, observing, participating, whatever. It's really helpful to kind of understand, like, okay, what do they need from play sessions? Like, as a designer, what are you expecting to get out of this? And you can start to kind of adjust your expectations. I think that, like you said, it's a thing that's happening whether you're there or not. It's also something that, as a researcher, it doesn't take a lot of resources, right? If you are an individual researcher, which, yeah, we were two researchers at the time, but like that was kind of it most days.
Yeah.
And we had a very extensive game that we had to cover. And we basically kind of split our time covering play sessions, tests, everything. But play sessions were great because it didn't require a lot of other people or input, a lot of time. They were generally something that we could turn around reasonably quickly. And so, for people that are working as smaller research teams, it's a great way to kind of get yourself in the door by understanding what the content is, the decision making, who makes the decisions, who's doing what designers are kind of working on what piece. You know who to go to, who your contacts are. And I think that it is being able to identify it helps you see like what your purpose there can be, right? And I think a lot of that is, we'll touch on kind of like the roles as a researcher, like in the play session process, because I think there's a couple of different roles that you can kind of break it down that we kind of figured out as our experience of doing that. But it's that we really kind of learn to integrate ourselves into that and understanding what our purpose is by just being able to assess what they actually needed from these. Because a lot of the times you're just like, I know I need feedback. I'm just not really sure how to get it, how to go about doing that. So I'm just going to get all of the people together that are sitting next to me or whomever, and working through and getting that feedback.
It's a very human experience too. Like just physically. Like I remember back then I just joined the floor because we were about to take care of PlayStation. Like I had to be there physically, and I know being embedded is a recurring topic, I think, in the podcast, and yeah. So basically, I had to be embedded because I had to be around to take care of those, and then I remember those experiences just with designers. Like it's a very particular moment also in the process. Like usually,
Yes.
because I think PlayStations they are most efficient at the very early, and
Yes.
and as a designer, you feel very vulnerable at that time because you're exploring, you're in the dark, you don't really know, and this is when you need feedback, and not feedback as validation. Like okay, everything is semi-polished, and now we push that externally to a service that will say, is it good or not? It's a bit, yeah, quite often it's too late. But even then, like this is not necessarily when it's the most valuable. At that time, also, it's yeah, again, like as a designer, very vulnerable because you have intentions and you're not sure how you're going to get there, and you're there to assist them, like to say, okay, I understand the struggles, what you're trying to achieve. I can see. Also observation, as you mentioned, like I think it's something that is easily dismissed. It's basic for user researcher, like comparing what is said and what you've seen. But sometimes internally, like designers will only think about what has been told.
Yep.
And
Not
being
what
there
they
just to
actually like
yes,
were doing, trying to figure out
yeah.
what was in the content. Yeah, for sure.
So just being there, watching, giving feedback, perspective at that time, I think yeah, it's it's kind of dumb to say, I guess, but it's a very human experience. Like it's a very a kind of fragile moment because
Yeah.
you are exploring and you're there to support them, and I think that builds from the get-go. It builds like a some sort of trusting relationship already, just because of
Just
the
building,
context.
yeah, it's building that empathy, right? And I think that it's getting communication, it's working on building like good channels of communication, a good solid working kind of empathetic relationship. And for me, I think it's like how we integrate ourselves is really, it's almost this like mindset shift a little bit where it's that we're not trying to think about like making this the most unbiased perfect piece of research experience like package as possible. It's really, you don't, it's not about making things better, right? I think that's when sometimes designers get a little uneasy when user research just like comes kicking the door down and they're like, we're here. It's because we we don't want to try and necessarily like make it better or less biased. I don't think that's the point here. I think it's really about understanding this mindset shift of we are here as a design tool, which is touching on in the last episode, but I think it's tying into this a lot where it's not to produce perfect unbiased research. It's really tapping into something that is happening around you that you're able to give really actionable, helpful information to a team to help them push forward to make decisions. And it's not the only thing, right? If your play sessions was the only piece of research that you were doing, then yes, you would probably need to figure out some way to like introduce some like rigor and control into some of this into this research. But it's not intended to be a one and done. It's really intended to kind of be, it's raising a flag in a lot of instances. It's kind of identifying and making quick pivots for iteration and identifying as a researcher when more research gets done. But yeah,
I
go
think
ahead.
yeah, It reminds me also of something that can be very, very valuable from a user researcher. Is that as I transition into a designer role, obviously I wouldn't take care of everything in the game. I just have a few mandates. But as a user researcher, I could work on basically all the feature, because we try to help on all of them that are going to the players. And so as a designer working on that specific feature, going through playsessions, having a user researcher that can tell me, okay, this is going to ship with that feature, or this feature is coming, or we know from this other thing or this other study or this other piece of content that it failed, or we had issues, or it was very good. Just having that perspective, I think, is very, very, very valuable.
Yes, 100%. And I think that leads a bit into kind of like what I want to go over kind of the different roles, because I think there's a lot of different ways that you can be involved and really leverage play sessions. And it's all about kind of recognizing what your purpose is and where your value add is going to be, either for yourself as a researcher or for the team, right? And I think it's in a very basic level, we kind of identified 4 different kind of slots that things kind of fit into. And I think that you can identify which bucket you want to get depending on what the needs are, what your impact can be. But basically, there's 4 different roles, right? So the first being participant. So as a researcher, you can participate in these design play sessions. It's a great way of being able to learn the content for yourself. Sometimes, especially with Siege, a lot of our issue was like, we need 10 people, right? I think that was a very specific thing that we always ran into, was that we oftentimes had to participate because it's difficult to find 10 people to be available for an hour to participate. So it's attending, observing, playing the content, asking questions, being there in kind of in it.
Yeah, and building that relationship too. Like,
yes,
I guess it's especially true, but at the end of the day, we are making a game and we are playing it.
Fun.
We're playing it. Yeah, we are playing it together, and then okay, like the designer can think, okay, you've played with me, and we went through that situation. Like, I know you understand what context I work with, and
Yes.
like I can trust that you know the game, and that what you will bring as information to me back, some feedback. Like, I feel like I can trust it more because I know you thought about this and that, and yeah, it's in terms of trust. I know it's something that is very important. Like, even just this morning, I was reading an email and we had a question. I was like, are they aware exactly of what we want? And just sometimes that little bit of friction, it can just disappear just because just you're around and playing with them.
Well, I think it's a fantastic point. I think it's a big piece of it. And I think it's identifying when you should be the participant, right? I think the other role, and what I feel as though often becomes the kind of holding point for a lot of researchers when we're thinking about play session, is the planner, right? We're really good at planning things. We are the party planners. We can organize everything up and down. We're really good at making sure everybody's going to be on time. They need to know when they're going to be there. So being the planner of a play session, you're organizing, you're getting all the right people in the room. What are the goals of the play session? You're really kind of making sure that people are there, and you're really kind of organizing that this thing is going to happen. I think this is where a lot of researchers fall into a trap of staying the planner for too long. And maybe it's even like, oh, I created a survey that other people, or a questionnaire that people are going to fill out after, and then I'm going to send the extract over to somebody, right? Know when your value comes from being a planner. It's not the end. Like, obviously, this is number 2 of 4. So there's obviously like other places for you to evolve to. And I think that the planner, where you're really organizing, but you're quite hands off in what's happening, is it's a dangerous place to stay. It's a great way to kind of help provide and really kind of ensure that these conversations are happening. but you want to not stay as the party planner for too long.
Yeah, it's. I think it's even more tricky because for people on a production, if they are not familiar with user research, it is what it is. It's already
Yes.
what a PlayStation is for them. Like it's just putting people in the same place playing a game.
You're just
That,
becoming
okay,
a coordinator.
yes, and for them, okay, that's the PlayStation. That's it. But because they are not familiar with all the rest, like observing, having clear objectives, taking feedback, working on next steps and stuff like that. But yeah, you're not educating them if you're just doing the planification, because for them it's just okay. That's what a precision is anyway. So there is no other stuff to think about anyway
You're
when
just
doing
kind of
precision, right?
removing.
So
You're just removing a task from their to-do list.
that's it. Yeah, and they don't see the value, and they don't and they cannot understand, and that's not to blame them at all. It's just a matter of educating.
It's up to us to be able to do that. And I think it's really showing the other things that we can do, you know. So it's moving. So we have participant, we have planner, the third one being the moderator, right? So I think this touches on specifically making sure that like it's a focus group moderation, right? It's making sure that you're kind of keeping conversation going. Maybe you're ensuring that specific topics are discussed during some sort of a debrief or discussion after playing the content. You're taking notes, you're potentially passing those notes along to the team, but it's really kind of moderating the discussion. I think there's a lot of value in this as well. Obviously, this is not like the final boss of play sessions for us, but like this is a good this is a good step towards becoming a bit more integrated, because you're able to make sure that you have a little bit more control over the conversation. This inherently would mean that you're kind of chatting with the designer ahead of time, wondering what questions they want to ask people, or maybe you're suggesting different questions that people can ask. But it's really about this kind of like focus group moderation of, you know, taking notes, making sure that there's some sort of organization to the debrief.
It's also important if you go back to the designer or production perspective. Also, as I mentioned before, like it's a very vulnerable moment in a way. Like you're just trying out the design and stuff, and what you can see very often, it's about, you know, letting your ego go in a little bit, like and wanting to justify your design or explain why something is still an issue at this point, and then it drags on, and then it's not about listening to players anymore, and it's very easy to fall into that. And I think, again, that's why I think the user researcher is very helpful.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of opportunity, and I think you can remember all of the times that we would try and educate the designers of like, okay, we're gonna be the ones to ask the questions. You know, we want to make sure we're being really as objective as possible, and you know, things would get heated. People would take things very personally. It's a very vulnerable time, and that's totally normal. And I think it's worth helping them understand that you can empathize with them, right? It's like, okay, it's okay. Like we're gonna get the feedback that you need, and like this is gonna be better because of it. And making sure that we're able to kind of get them the information that they need. And so I think being the moderator of the conversation is an important piece. I think the final kind of layer of the roles of the play sessions is really, I'm calling it the facilitator, and I think it's handling all of the kind of aspects of it. And it's not even necessarily like, oh, I have to be the participant, the planner, the moderator. I have to do everything. It's really this kind of mindset around facilitating conversation around the play sessions. So it's integrating the play session and the feedback that comes out of it, the way in which it's kind of run into the decision making process by helping guide next steps, right? A big part of us facilitating play sessions for a very long time was like the debrief of the debrief, right? And it was the next steps conversations, and it was really okay, designer, we discussed this operator prototype that you have. Here was the feedback. We were there to give the very quick high level of like, here's the summary based on the feedback. Because as a designer, often they would only remember that one negative comment that somebody said, and suddenly they can't let it go. And I'm not saying like it's obviously that's a very difficult thing, right? It's a very vulnerable moment. You don't want to hear that like your concept didn't work or people didn't like it. And so we would notice that sometimes conversation was getting steered based on the kind of personal subjective feelings of the person that had their content being kind of evaluated almost. And I think that as a facilitator, what we were really focusing on was providing the kind of the key takeaways of the play session, right? I mean, that's a lot of what we're doing when we're doing research. We're kind of compiling the findings and we're giving the kind of executive summary or the key takeaways. And we could facilitate the next steps conversation of saying, okay, how do we want to act on this feedback? And what else do you need to know to make a decision? And we were really the ones kind of asking those questions, being a part of it. When things start to get really heated again, we're able to step in and say, okay, all right, hold on, let's go back to what the discussion was. These were the comments. Remember, we saw people doing this because we were observing people too. We saw them using it. And so we're like, remember, they said this, but we saw them using it in this way. Is that what we're looking for? And so we were able to kind of keep the conversation grounded a bit.
Yeah, and I think it's also very interesting to give perspective and again education about what user research can be, because sometimes even just let's say a classic user test, you just end up with a build with some stuff in it, and you go externally to people that are going to do a user test on your thing, and it feels like a process and something you go through, and same with the play sessions, like at a very small scale, could feel like, okay, let's do a play session every week.
Yes.
But maybe actually that's not a good call, because you need to address some stuff that came up. It's not just a process you go through because you have to. Sometimes you just skip sessions for 2 weeks, and that's okay, and that's fine. You don't need to go through it again. And I think that's when user research is super helpful. Those next steps, like okay, let's not play it again until we fix these issues, until we find an answer to that piece of feedback, and sometimes also just, oh, let me dig deeper into that thing. I remember something, we mentioned something a bit like that in the past about something else. Let me dig into that, come back to you, and just take our time. And yeah, I think that's something like that is very important. Like it's not a process and that you just do for the sake of it. Like you just take your time. Sometimes like always challenging them on when and how to test things, and it was also the next steps was also like, actually the next step is on us. I think now is a good time to have a user test.
Yes.
It's time to go externally, because that's it. I think we tried all the possibilities. We don't have enough perspective anymore. We cannot move on anymore because we need external feedback or a different form of feedback, different form of study. And so sometimes we were part of the next step itself.
Yeah. Well, I think that illustrates the power, right? Like that is the exact situation of why we're talking about. This is something that's so powerful to leverage and be a part of, because it really allows us to become more integrated, making sure that we're keeping an eye on things that could potentially come up as tests. It makes it a lot easier to kind of quote unquote convince the team that they need to be able to do a user test, right? Because there's always like, oh, we're not ready, it's not ready, it's not ready. But they can start to feel and see, and we had that happen all the time, where we would basically be like, hey, based on what you're telling me and what you need, I think we probably need to do a user test. And there was rarely resistance to that. Once we became very integrated into this and we were really facilitating the majority of these bigger kind of play sessions, it just made that conversation just move along like so easily into, the next steps is on us. And it was very easy for them to see the value of, okay, I see why we need to do that.
And sometimes the other way also, like
Yes.
actually no, you're not ready for user test yet. Like we like we already saw like main issues that we can still solve internally before resorting to user testness and just iterate faster than with all the thing that we need to put in place for an external user test. So it went both ways, yeah. And so I guess I cheated because I could listen to the previous podcast with Julien.
Yes. You got the
So
sneak
hopefully,
preview.
yes, hopefully you've been able to listen to it as well before this one, but also like it was so much easier for us as user researcher to not be there after. Like it's not about getting your objective after the fact. Like before all the things it went through, and then yeah, your objectives for once you go into an external user test or any kind of study that you do externally, and like a more formal one, let's say, you're ready for it because you know everything that has happened before, why designers landed on some specific solutions at this point in time, what is not addressed just yet, but could be addressed in the future. So you know already like the limitations of what could be your external test, and you know the whole history, and you're ready for it basically already. So it's very valuable because you build trust along the way, and you just made your life much easier as a user researcher. So I mean, it was very nice to be able to work this way.
I think it was a very pleasant experience for us as researchers as well. I think it was helpful. We could really see the value that we were bringing to the team, and it was very easy for us because we weren't constantly feeling like we were one step behind, trying to, oh hey, we should do research, or like, oh yeah, let's do this or let's do that, or we really could understand where we could identify very easily where our value was. And I mean, obviously, like it's very difficult. Like we were very fortunate that we had the right people at the right time, and we were really able to educate and integrate ourselves in that way. But I think that play sessions really was like that jumping off point to getting us to be very integrated, very blended. A lot of these concepts that we've talked a lot about on the podcast was really originated because of what we did with the play sessions on Siege. But I want to talk about, sorry,
go ahead.
so we don't run out of time because we're taking a long time. I want to quickly cover, because we've kind of demonstrated these different roles, talked a little bit about kind of why this is really important, but I want, like, what did this actually look like, right? And I think it's talking briefly on like what we typically did for a play session to really kind of help people get an idea of the actual steps that we were taking, so that they can potentially do that as well. Do you want to touch on that?
Yes, I'm trying to remember as you mentioned it.
Start touching on a few and then you can fill in.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay. So I think I think if we're assuming that we're kind of the facilitators, right? I want to look at the full picture. So this was often having conversations ahead of time, really thinking about getting the intentions of the content. So really trying to sit with the designer and understand the design, making sure we knew when, like, why they wanted to do a play session, and helping know, like, okay, we're going to do this play session today. What information can we get out of it to help them move forward? It was always making sure we were going to be able to move forward after. Maybe it was taking 2 steps back to be able to move forward, but we wanted to make sure the actions were going to be able to be taken. So it was really making sure the team, they understood what the design that they were presenting. We wanted to make sure we were able to present what the key facets of the design were. So if we had participants who were less familiar, or maybe something's not fully integrated in the build, we were the ones to kind of present that. We were running a lot of the kind of actual planning for a lot of the pieces. We'd set up a lot of meetings, a lot of processes, a lot of other kind of more boring stuff, which we can touch on at a later point if people have questions. But we were kind of making sure we were sending out the meeting invites on Outlook, like making sure that people knew there was a play session happening. We were identifying maybe like, oh, we need people who are a little more experienced, right? You always have those people on the production that are like really, really high skilled players. Let's tap them. Or we'd had people who maybe were less familiar with the game. So we tapped those individuals in addition to some of the designers. So we were kind of helping curate the audience that was participating in the play session. We were often making sure that they were getting a build and that they knew where whoever was in charge, they knew that a build was needed and where it needed to be. We were very, very fortunate that specifically in our situation on Siege, we had dedicated kind of PC area, a little lounge, as I think we referred to it back then, where we were able to push all of the builds. And so basically we made sure that the builds were getting pushed to the lounge, they were launching appropriately, and that everything was kind of there.
I think that's the trick about the planner role you mentioned before.
Yes.
Like it was very nice for them. Like you just have a meeting, okay, you move on to that lounge, and then someone will tell you all about the design. You will just sit, play, and tell them what you think. So yeah, it's so
you could see where the trap of getting stuck as the planner occurred.
Yeah.
But I think it was the after all of that, right? So we were observing the play session. We were really we would stand behind the people playing the content. You know, we would sometimes have to prevent the designers from telling people how to play the content. You know, we were kind of policing the area, making sure nobody was giving away the secrets or telling people what to do. And then we would coordinate the debriefs. So usually we had very specific questions, right? I mean, anything what we would typically do if we were running a user test. We had specific research questions we wanted to evaluate, and we ran the discussions. We got the feedback from everybody. We made sure that we understood the designs, making sure we understood kind of the concerns and the comments. And then we would move to the next steps conversations, which was typically a smaller group of people. It was not the people that attended the play sessions per se. It was really more the decision makers. So this was usually like in our case on Siege, a lot of the times it was, you know, the game directors or the kind of key stakeholders, the designers, the kind of core cell team that was involved. We would all then go and have the debrief of the debrief, discuss the feedback, discuss, you know, what the next steps were, you know, like you were saying before, do we need to run a user test? Do we need to go back to the drawing board? Are we happy with this design? Do we want to call, like, is this the one? Is this the concept that we want to go forward with? And so we were really kind of helping facilitate that. And then we would usually send a recap. So we would basically have, okay, here was like the key takeaways from the play session. Here was the key takeaways of the next steps discussion, implicating whoever was in charge of doing what thing. So like, okay, this specific designer or, you know, the programmer is going to evaluate, like, can we make this change? We feel like if we changed the timing on this thing, then that would help. So we're going to have them change the timer, and we're going to do a quick play session again tomorrow, evaluate, and then we're going to move into planning for a user test. So it was really kind of just wrapping up that whole package. We had everything in writing. We were really able to say, we actually had documents. We kept an internal wiki of all of the play sessions, all of the notes from the play sessions. So the next time one came around, if I had run a play session, Seb could then look through and see, like, okay, Lanie's play session last time, this was the discussion. All right, great. And so that he already had an idea of where we've been and what decisions had already been taken.
Yeah, long term, that's also very valuable. Remember, we also had all of our research. So I think the small, it's a detail, but I think it's important. But the mindset we adopted was not to have somewhere where all the research would be, but the other way, like having somewhere for your features where all the feedback would be.
Yes.
From user tests, play sessions, and stuff. And that made much more sense for them. And also, it's very good when something would happen. Also, maybe during a user test, something comes up and okay, it rings a bell, or oh, why did we land on that solution? What happened before? Okay, if we go back to this, okay, but we tried this before. And having an history of all of that, like, was also very valuable.
Yeah.
Even for prototypes also that wouldn't ship,
It's
basically.
huge.
And sometimes it's a prototype you go back after a year, like a year later, you go back to a prototype and then you can see again. And so that was valuable also long term. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it was really about kind of making sure that we were supporting them in a way that made sense for them, right? And I think that it helped as a whole. Play sessions really helped kind of strengthen our relationships. It really kind of helped us become blended within the design. It gave us a lot of really great unique opportunities to educate our partners on what we could do for them, really opening up doors to doing significantly more research. Especially in our case, this was really helpful because there had been a lull of research for a while. And so it was really helpful in kind of getting them to know us, trusting us being able to understand their needs and be able to kind of rebuild almost that. It really helped kind of, we've talked about like the iteration black box, right? And I think that it really removed that black box kind of impact where we were able to understand what decisions were being made and why, because we were there and we were actually helping facilitate that conversation. And so we were able to really expect when decisions were going to be made. We were able to understand, we were able to help inform so they could make the best, more well-informed decision that they could. Um, and yeah, we were able to suggest kind of future research, whether that was we should do a follow-up of a user test or we should run these pro workshops or whatever. We had a lot of different types of research in our toolkit at that point. And so it helped us kind of bridge that gap towards these kind of internal, maybe messy, a little bit biased type of pieces of research into the more kind of structured packages that we were accustomed to. And I think one thing that can't be overstated enough is that it's just, this was really great because we did have a fairly small team at that point. It was really you and I, and we had a lot of content that was being made and kind of going through. And so this is something that is really great for smaller teams, people that have maybe less resources. You can really get creative, right? I think it's knowing the different roles that are available to you, the different ways in which you can get involved, understanding that, you know, you want to be able to be kind of that like design tool, right? You're really kind of helping push the design forward, helping them make decisions. Um, I want to end on one topic specifically, Seb. This
Yeah,
is where
I
I'd
would
like
have
your
another one too. Yeah,
perspective.
depending on how much time we have. But yeah, I think there's one thing. Maybe just I'm gonna be super short on that. But I think what is interesting with PlayStation is that maybe as a user researcher, it looks like okay, plenty of bias. It's just pen and paper playing. Doesn't look very good. Maybe like it doesn't look fancy
Yeah.
and all. But actually, I think we shouldn't we should never like underestimate the importance of where we put our expertise in there. Because for
Yes.
example, in debriefs, for example, and next steps, like there is one player at this issue, for example, with that piece of content. As a designer or part of production, it can be super tricky to deal with that. But as a user researcher, you can say, okay, this one is just an exception because of that context. It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Or actually, this one is super important. It's actually, I think, it made me realize that this is a potential issue that we should monitor. And so then you, with just a pen and paper, you can bring your expertise at this key moment. And because the way, maybe it's going to sound a little bit harsh, but if you happen to do research too late, you're just going to you bring your expertise on broken foundations basically, and it's too
Yes.
late. And I think yes, it's just like having a few people around playing a game, and you pen and paper and having a focus group with them full of bias, just a pen and paper, but actually it's a great moment to leverage your expertise and have impact. I think there is a very stark contrast between what you just do, but actually the value also of your expertise at that moment in time.
Yes.
So yeah.
I think, and I think that's a big part of why it worked so well for us, because I think that you and I are very aligned with kind of our love for this kind of like scrappy,
Mhm.
very kind of just like pen and paper type of research. And I think that this really fed into that a lot because we both kind of had the natural tendency to operate that way. And I think that this really forced us to bring your expertise, right? It's not, your expertise is not just your ability to identify the correct method to run a type of test. It's really about bringing this whole other perspective and understanding of, okay, I understand that this one person made this comment and that feels very impactful, but here's why I don't think it's an issue, right? I think that that's a really phenomenal point to remember and be able to bring, to recognize that you can bring that, because I think that's what our role is in this, is really helping to kind of untangle, I guess, all of the feedback and everything kind of coming at them. It's just kind of helping push forward and say, hey, like, this is something that feels so basic and so easy, right? I'm just going to roll up with my pen and paper and start taking notes. But I think that's, I don't know, I think that's what makes it such an interesting option for researchers, because it helps you really practice to be able to bring your expertise outside of the test room and really contextualize what you know about the player's experience based on all of the past research, your just fundamental understanding of heuristics or just research practices in general, and putting that to work
Yeah,
in a very kind
contextual.
of, in a very different environment, in a little bit of kind of this uncontrolled environment. But I think I really truly believe that's where you have this really phenomenal value and influence in being able to help.
And even for you as a user researcher, like I think contextualizing the decision making process and the technical limitations. Also, it will just also alleviate maybe some frustrations that can happen. Like
Yes.
if you just end up being a service outside providing feedback, just why aren't they acting on that? What is
Yep.
happening? And actually you're there in the moment with them, and then you can understand. Okay, now I understand. Okay, the engine has limitations, or
Yeah.
or or maybe it's not the right moment. We are waiting for another feature. Like plenty of things can happen and explain a lot of the decisions taken about the design too. So
Sure.
it's even for yourself, like it's good as a user researcher.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it gives context so that you're not constantly feeling like frustrated. I don't know why they did that. I don't know. They could solve all of their problems if they just made this one change, and you keep kind of making suggestions or recommendations, or kind of having this kind of this being, this frustration towards, why aren't they just changing this thing? It could solve all of their problems. Well, come to find out, the engine doesn't actually support us to be able to do that thing. So we need to get creative as researchers to help them problem solve and find ways to alleviate this issue. And so it's like there's two very different problems, and the way in which you approach them are very reliant on kind of your understanding of the process and like what's happening outside. It's so easy to get tunnel vision, right? Like, I did this one piece of research, here's what happened in the test room, this thing happened, and you kind of sometimes, I see it a lot with more junior researchers, right, where you fail to kind of take that step back and look at the bigger picture and identify, like, is this really an issue? Is this going to be as impactful as it's looking like it is right now? Or does it look really impactful, but over time or in the actual correct gameplay context, it's not going to be an issue? That's where we need to be able to step in and say, okay, let's make sure we're taking a step back. We need to be the ones to help remind them to do that.
Yeah, I think that's the most valuable thing, like perspective. I think it's a very interesting tension between I feel between those two. Like you want to be embedded, be part of the process, understand the struggles, and you want to be part of all of that, but you also want to be to bring perspective and be outside of that, like no
Yep.
ego, no, and just avoid everything that a production has to deal with. So it's a very very interesting tension to play with, and yeah, I think it's like the perspective is the most valuable thing we can bring. I think as user
Yep.
researcher, and we always have to remember that. I think.
Okay. We're running out of time. We've already gone overtime. But I think it was a really good kind of final point, though, really,
I
to
hope
bring up
so.
the kind of this perspective. And I think being on the other side of this, I know you've kind of touched on it quite a few times. I wonder kind of what your final takeaway, as a designer, kind of, what do you wish the research team could provide, or what kind of advice or input would you give to them to best work with you?
I think I want researchers to make me trust them. Like it's easy to trust. Like say you trust them and then don't really trust them. Like I want them to make me feel like okay, they understand the design, they understand where I'm trying to go with that piece of design, what we want to create as an experience. I want to be able to trust that. I think that alleviates a lot of friction then, because I can just tell you what I need, and then I can just trust you to come back with valuable feedback. And
Seems
also,
like trust in this context is really like understanding the design,
yeah,
right? It's really kind of being able to think about what the decisions you've made, why you've made them, what kind of successes or failures have happened, being able to have this kind of full picture of what the goals are. What are we
yes,
trying to achieve? What are the goals? What steps have we taken, and what steps do we want to take?
and have that entire conversation, because it's funny, because now that I think about it, it's if you just ask for objectives to a designer or anyone on production, it's too limiting. It's a bit like waiting for suggestions from a user, or just not, not digging too much, and not going to the root of the problem during a user test. You have to do that with users and find the actual issue that's lying there. And it's the same with designers. Like, you don't want to just stop at the first thing, because usually it's the result of a result of a result of an intention. And if you just
Yes.
stop at this, you probably won't bring the most valuable feedback or perspective on the content. So you have to do the same with a designer. Like, just dig and dig and dig, and sometimes you don't need to dig because you've been there since the beginning, so you understand the whole process. So
Yeah.
I think that's where the value comes from for PlaySessions. But yeah, I think it's also something that is very valuable. Let's talk about design intentions and what we want to achieve as an experience overall,
Shared
and not
goals.
just yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. I'm going to cut you off before you start sharing more tidbits, because then we can flow this into another episode.
Yes, yes, yes.
I feel like we
Just
can probably sit and continue chatting about this. Seb and I frequently get lunch and get lost for hours talking about these types of topics. So if anybody listening has kind of questions or comments or other things that maybe we touched on kind of lightly or kind of glossed over a little bit, please let us know. Obviously, we would be more than happy to continue this conversation. I'm sure I have a whole list of potential topic ideas where Seb and I can kind of sit down and discuss. As additionally as kind of talking a little bit about your role, right? What you're doing as a UX designer, and kind of how user research can work and integrate with that. I think we could be a great follow up. So if anybody has questions for Seb or I, and we can spin that into another episode, we will happily sit down for another hour and go through it. But Seb, I don't usually call you Seb, so it feels weird to call you that. But
let's not. Yeah, let's cut the podcast short. Let's stop there.
we're gonna
Let's not talk
keep the
about the
nicknames
many
out of it.
names.
But
Yes.
thank you so much. I really appreciate it. It's of course always great to be able to reminisce on the work that we did together and how we were able to achieve what we did. And I always appreciate your perspective, because obviously you come from a different background as from me. So thank you so much for taking the time to discuss, and we will catch you all very soon.
Yeah, it was a pleasure. Thank you, and bye everyone.